Before money, payday did not arrive in an envelope. It arrived on the back of a donkey. Imagine a stoneworker walking home through the Egyptian desert more than 3,000 years ago. He has spent the day cutting a royal tomb into the cliffs across the Nile from Thebes. Dust covers his skin. His tools are worn. His household is waiting for the payment that should have arrived from the state granary. But there are no coins in his future. His wages are measured in grain. Sacks of emmer, wheat, and barley are supposed to reach the workers' village each month. The grain can become bread, porridge, or beer. Some can feed the family. Some can be exchanged for fish, vegetables, pottery, clothing, oil, furniture, or the repair of a tool. Other supplies may arrive too: water, fuel, cakes, dates, and occasionally meat. The worker is not being given a symbolic reward. He is receiving the materials from which daily life is made. Then one month, the grain is late. The family cannot eat a promise written by a scribe. The worker cannot tell the baker that the royal storehouse is experiencing a temporary administrative delay. His employer is the pharaoh, the most powerful man in the known world. Yet the worker's kitchen is running out of food. When the delay continues, the workmen put down their tools. They leave the royal tombs and sit near important temples, demanding the rations owed to them. The protest recorded during the reign of Ramesses III is often described as the first documented labor strike in history. Their complaint reveals something modern people easily miss. Ancient wages were not fake money. When the grain stopped, life stopped. The phrase wages before money needs one careful distinction. These workers lived in an economy that already understood prices, debts, accounting, and units of value. Silver could be weighed. Grain could be measured. Goods could be priced in a unit such as the deben, even when no matching piece of metal changed hands. What they generally did not use for ordinary salaries was a standardized supply of minted coins. Coins and money are not the same thing. A coin is an object. Money is a system for measuring value, storing purchasing power, settling obligations, and making exchange easier. Ancient societies could perform those jobs with grain, weighed metal, written accounts, and trusted equivalencies. So the real question is not how anyone worked before value existed. It is how an employer could compensate hundreds or thousands of people when payroll could not be sent as portable cash. The answer begins in the field. Most early economies were agricultural. Their largest, most predictable flow of wealth appeared at harvest. Governments, temples, and large estates collected grain as tax, rent, tribute, or produce from their own land. That grain entered storehouses controlled by institutions. The same institutions needed labor. They needed farmers, herders, porters, quarrymen, boat crews, guards, scribes, weavers, bakers, brewers, soldiers, and craftsmen. These people had to eat while they worked, including during months when their labor had not yet produced anything that could be sold. Grain connected the two sides. The state collected food from one group and issued it as compensation to another. A tax payment entered the granary. A wage payment left it. The institution did not need to sell the grain for coins and then hand those coins to a worker who would use them to buy grain again. It could skip the middle step. This made the ancient payroll look like a redistribution machine. Resources moved from fields to storehouses, from storehouses to workers, and from workers into kitchens and local markets. The system was practical because grain possessed several useful qualities. Everyone needed it. It could be divided into measured quantities. It was produced in enormous volume, and its value was understood across much of society. A worker paid in a chair would first have to find somebody who wanted that chair. A worker paid in a goat would face the problem of dividing it. A worker paid in grain received something his household could consume every day, and his neighbors would usually accept in exchange. Grain was not perfect money, but it was excellent survival. This is why the famous idea that Egyptian workers were paid in beer is both memorable and misleading. Beer mattered. It was a common food and drink, and beer could be supplied as part of institutional provisions. Barley could also be brewed at home or exchanged. But the principal monthly salary rations recorded for the royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina were distributions of emmer wheat and barley. Bread and beer were often the finished products of the grain, not two amusing extras added to a modern paycheck. The thumbnail version of history says a man built a pyramid for a jug of beer. The economic version is more interesting. His household received a bundle of commodities designed to reproduce the labor force. The bundle had to provide calories, fuel cooking, supply water, maintain tools, and support dependents. It was less like receiving a bar tab and more like receiving salary, groceries, and employee benefits in one delivery. Even the word wage can hide important differences. The surviving records are also uneven. Palaces and temples generated documents because they managed large groups. The casual arrangement between a farmer and two harvest helpers was less likely to survive on clay, papyrus, or limestone. There was no single ancient labor market. There were many systems sitting beside one another. One person worked because he owed service to the state. Another received a fixed ration from a temple. Another was hired for the harvest and paid when it ended. Another produced cloth for an institution and received grain. Another negotiated payment in weighed silver. Another had no legal power to refuse the work at all. Calling all of these people employees would be wrong. Pretending none of them earned wages would also be wrong. The essential economic exchange existed whenever labor was provided in return for an expected share of resources. That exchange forced ancient employers to solve the same questions that appear on a payroll today. Who worked? For how long? At what skill level? What were they owed? Had payment already been delivered? And who was absent? The answers created records. At Deir el-Medina, scribes tracked attendance, assignments, supplies, and deliveries on papyrus and flakes of limestone or pottery called ostraca. The surviving texts mention workers, prices, food supplies, wood, fish, vegetables, donkey hire, business deals, and promises of payment. An absent worker might have a reason recorded beside his name. A crew could be divided into groups, supervised by foremen, and served by scribes. Deliveries had to be measured and attributed because one missing sack was not an abstract accounting error. It was a household's monthly security. Writing turned food into payroll. Without a record, the foreman might claim that 20 sacks had been issued while workers insisted that only 15 arrived. With a list, administrators could state what left the storehouse, what reached the village, and what remained owed. Of course, the record did not guarantee honesty. It made dishonesty countable. Measurement was the second technology behind wages. Grain varies. A sack can be loosely filled. A container can be shaved down. Damp grain weighs more. Poor grain contains husks, dirt, or pests. If compensation depends on volume, the measuring vessel becomes as politically important as a modern payslip. Ancient administrations developed standardized units and containers because vague generosity could not run a permanent workforce. A ration had to be repeatable. The worker needed to know what 1 month of compensation meant, while the employer needed to estimate how much grain a project would consume. This allowed labor to become a budget. If one worker receives a stated quantity each month, an administrator can multiply that ration by the size of the crew and the duration of the project. He can compare the total with grain in the storehouse. He can request more from estates, reduce distributions, delay work, or pretend that the shortage will solve itself. The monument begins as a calculation in food. How many workers can the harvest support? How long can they remain away from their own fields? How much surplus must be collected before stone can move? This is the hidden economics behind ancient construction. A ruler may command a tomb, wall, or temple, but command alone does not produce it. The workforce needs thousands of meals before the structure creates any political or religious value. The granary is therefore part of the building site. Every column of grain makes a column of stone possible. Payment in kind also changed the meaning of a wage difference. Higher ranking, more skilled, or more responsible workers could receive larger allocations than ordinary laborers. Foremen and scribes held advantages not only because their titles sounded impressive, but because additional grain created market power. A household can eat only so much cereal. Once its basic needs are covered, surplus grain becomes exchangeable income. It can be traded for furniture, livestock, cloth, oil, or services. It can be lent. It can help finance a marriage, pay a debt, or survive a failed delivery. The first portion of the wage prevents hunger. The surplus creates wealth. That distinction matters because two rations can look similar in official records while producing different lives. A subsistence ration leaves the worker dependent on the next delivery. A larger ration creates savings and choices. The gap between them is not merely more bread, it is bargaining power. The household was the real unit behind the wage. The person named on a work list was rarely the only person supported by the payment. Spouses, children, elderly relatives, and servants might all consume or process what arrived. Grain had to be milled, dough had to be prepared, beer had to be brewed, fuel and water had to be obtained, storage jars had to be protected from heat, moisture, insects, and theft. A sack of grain was not dinner. It became dinner through more labor. Much of that work happened inside the household and often fell to women. This reveals a cost hidden by payment in kind. The employer delivered a raw or partly processed commodity while the worker's family performed the final manufacturing. A modern company pays money and lets a household decide where to purchase food. An ancient institution could deliver grain and transfer the work of turning it into meals to the household itself. The nominal wage was the quantity at the door. The usable wage was what remained after grinding, brewing, baking, spoilage, and exchange. Payment in kind also transferred quality risk. If the grain was old, damp, or contaminated, the written amount could be correct, while the real wage was lower. If containers were short or deliveries included unusable material, workers lost purchasing power without any official reduction in the number recorded. This is an ancient version of inflation hidden inside the product. The label stays the same. What it buys becomes smaller. Yet grain wages protected workers from another kind of inflation. Suppose food prices rise after a poor harvest. A worker paid a fixed amount of silver can now buy less bread. A worker promised a fixed physical quantity of grain is owed the same calories, provided the employer actually delivers it. The institution bears more of the market price risk because it must obtain the grain regardless of its exchange value. This makes an in-kind wage valuable during scarcity. It also makes default more tempting. When grain becomes expensive, a storehouse has stronger reason to delay, reduce, or redirect it. The promise that protected the worker becomes costly for the employer at exactly the moment the worker needs it most. That tension appears in the strike at Deir el-Medina. The men who cut and decorated the royal tombs were not an anonymous mass of starving labourers dragged to work. They were specialised employees living in a purpose-built community. Their skills, organisation and records gave them a collective identity. They knew what the state owed because the payment schedule was established. When deliveries fell behind during the late reign of Ramesses III, they did something economically sophisticated. They withheld labour. Their tools had value only while they used them. The unfinished tomb mattered to the state, especially because royal death did not wait for administrative convenience. By leaving the worksite and staging protests near sacred and administrative spaces, the crew made a private shortage publicly visible. The state possessed more grain than any worker. The workers possessed the labour the state could not instantly replace. The strike tested which scarcity mattered more. Officials responded with deliveries and negotiations, but problems returned. This was not a modern union contract, and the evidence does not show a permanent victory. It shows that wages create an obligation powerful employers cannot always dismiss. Once compensation is expected, delay becomes a breach. Once workers can coordinate, hunger becomes leverage. The protest also exposes the weakness of a non-cash payroll. Grain had to move physically from institutional estates and granaries to the village. Every stage offered a point of failure. A harvest could be poor. A boat could arrive late. An official could divert supplies. A granary could report quantities that did not exist. Political disorder could interrupt collection. Corruption could consume the difference. And because a sack is heavy, the state could not repair the delay by writing a number on a distant account. Payroll had logistics. Coins would later reduce this problem, but they would not eliminate it. A bag of silver is easier to transport than a season of grain, yet the worker must still find food to buy. Cash moves the distribution problem from employer to market. With grain wages, the state must deliver the food. With cash wages, the state delivers purchasing power, and the worker must hope food is available at an affordable price. Each system places risk in a different place. Ancient Mesopotamia developed similar solutions under different institutions. Temples, palaces, and large households distributed barley, oil, and wool to workers and dependents. Clay tablets recorded quantities with an administrative precision that can make a 4,000-year-old payroll look strangely familiar. Names or categories appear beside commodities and amounts. Men, women, and children could receive different allocations. Status, age, task, and institutional relationship affected the ration. The list did not merely feed people, it encoded hierarchy. One line of barley might represent a worker. A smaller line might represent his dependent. A larger issue might identify an official. The columns turned social rank into measurable consumption. But scholars have to be cautious with the word wage here too. Some Mesopotamian distributions compensated hired work. Others supported permanent dependents, forced laborers, or enslaved people. A ration large enough to maintain a person is not automatically evidence of free employment. Food can be payment. It can also be control. An institution that supplies every monthly measure makes departure costly. A worker with land, animals, or customers has resources outside the employer. A dependent whose household eats from the institutional storehouse may lose everything by leaving. The wage keeps the worker alive and ties the worker to the source. This is one reason ancient compensation often mixed economic reward with social status. A person could receive land, housing, rations, clothing, a share of production, or access to institutional resources in return for service. The complete package mattered more than a single monthly number. A soldier might be maintained through land, assigned to support him. A temple worker might receive provisions and a share connected to office. A farm laborer might receive food during the job and grain at its completion. A craft worker might be given raw material, then compensated for finished output. A shepherd might keep a portion of the animal's products. These were different ways of answering the same question. How can the person who controls resources motivate the person who controls labor? One answer was a daily ration. Another was piecework. Another was a share. If a harvest worker receives part of the crop, employer and worker share production risk. A good harvest increases both rewards. A bad one reduces both. If the worker receives a fixed quantity, the employer keeps the upside, but owes the wage even when yields disappoint. The form of payment decides who absorbs uncertainty. This is as true in an ancient field as it is in a modern office. Fixed compensation offers security but limits upside. Profit sharing offers opportunity but moves risk toward labor. Payment in advance helps the worker survive but exposes the employer to desertion. Payment at the end protects the employer but forces the worker to finance his own life while waiting. Ancient contracts and law codes reveal attempts to set wages for hired labor. The famous laws associated with Hammurabi specify payments for certain workers and services, sometimes using grain or weighed silver as standards. The rules do not prove that every worker received exactly the official rate. They show that compensation had become important enough for rulers to present it as part of legal order. The wage was no longer merely a private favor. It was a category the state could name. Weighed silver expanded the possibilities of pay before coins existed. Silver was durable, compact, and divisible. A worker or contractor paid by weight did not have to store bulky grain. Metal could preserve value across seasons and travel farther. But silver carried costs. It had to be weighed. Its purity had to be trusted. Small payments were awkward, and many ordinary transactions could still be completed through goods or credit without metal physically appearing. A stated silver price was therefore often a language of value rather than proof that somebody handed over a neat silver bar. Egyptians could price an object in a metal weight unit, and settle the exchange with a combination of commodities judged equivalent. This is sometimes described as barter, but simple barter fails to capture it. In pure barter, two people swap objects because each wants what the other has. In an accounting economy, several goods can be compared through a common standard. A bed, jar, garment, and quantity of grain may all be assigned values in the same unit. The buyer can assemble payment from acceptable items until the total reaches the agreed price. The transaction has a monetary calculation even without a coin. The unit of account does the invisible work. This mattered enormously for wages. Once the grain ration had a recognized value, a worker could mentally translate labor into other goods. He did not need every seller to want his exact type of work. He needed the wage commodity to be widely accepted or the account value to be credible. The local economy grew around payday. When rations arrived, households possessed tradable surplus. Craftspeople, fishers, farmers, and merchants could sell goods to workers who had just received grain. Credit extended between deliveries could be settled. A shopkeeper might wait because he knew the state ration was scheduled. The wage pulse became a market pulse. Then a delayed delivery spread beyond the work crew. The worker could not pay the person who had advanced vegetables. That seller could not settle another obligation. One missing payroll moved through several households. Ancient wage arrears created the same chain reaction as modern wage arrears. The object owed was different. The dependence was not. Coins changed that calculation because they compressed value. A small quantity of stamped metal could represent much more than its volume in grain. The stamp reduced the need to weigh and test every piece. Soldiers, merchants, and tax collectors could move it across long distances. Governments could demand coins in taxes and pay them back out as wages, helping create a population that needed and accepted the currency. But the transition was slow and uneven. The earliest coins appeared in Western Anatolia in the 7th century BCE, long after Egyptian and Mesopotamian administrations had mastered large workforces. Coins did not sweep instantly into every village. People continued receiving grain, food, land, and other goods even in economies where coinage circulated. Cash was useful, not magical. For an employer, coin wages outsourced storage and choice. The worker could decide whether to buy bread, beer, cloth, or oil. The state no longer needed to assemble a personalized bundle of necessities. For a worker, coins increased portability and freedom. Savings took less space, a wage could travel, different sellers could compete for it. The household no longer had to accept the precise mixture delivered by an institution. Yet freedom came with new exposure. If food prices rose while the coin wage stayed fixed, hunger returned. If merchants refused the coin or debased currency lost trust, the stamped object could fail. If no food reached the market, a purse full of metal could not be eaten. Grain wages guaranteed a commodity but restricted choice. Coin wages expanded choice but did not guarantee the commodity. The history of pay is a history of moving risk between employer, worker, and market. That history did not begin with a paycheck. It began when one person controlled more food than he could consume and another person controlled labor that had not yet been rewarded. The wage connected them across time. Work happens first. Payment may come later. That delay creates power. The employer can promise resources that have not yet arrived. The worker can trust, refuse, leave, protest, or borrow while waiting. Records, laws, and standardized measures developed partly because a future payment is easy to deny unless evidence survives. This is what the ostraca from Deir el-Medina preserve. Not merely lists of old food. They preserve expectations. A quantity beside a name says that this person's labor had a recognized claim on the storehouse. An attendance record says time could be converted into entitlement. A complaint about missing supplies says the worker understood that entitlement well enough to challenge the state. The first payroll was therefore more than distribution. It was a promise made measurable. And once a promise is measurable, people can see when it is broken. Return to the worker walking home through the desert. If the donkey train has arrived, He does not hear coins clinking. He sees sacks lowered to the ground. A scribe checks the list. Measures of wheat and barley pass from state storage into the hands of the crew. Part of his wage will become bread. Part may become beer. Part may be traded for fish, oil, or a stool made by a neighbour. Part may cover a debt taken while the delivery was late. And if the allocation is large enough, a small part may remain for the future. The payment looks normal because everybody in the village understands it. No one needs a coin to tell them the grain has value. They know how many meals it can produce, what a potter will accept for a jar, and how long the store will last. That knowledge is the currency. The measuring vessel defines the amount. The scribe protects the claim. The granary backs the promise. The household turns the payment into life. And the worker returns to the tomb because the system has worked for one more month. Wages before money were not piles of random goods exchanged in a primitive world. They were organized claims on food, materials, and institutional surplus. They required taxation, storage, measurement, accounting, logistics, and trust. They could support skilled communities and enormous public works. They could also trap dependents, encode inequality, and collapse when administrators failed. Beer was part of the story, but it was never the whole paycheck. The real wage was the right to take a share of the economy's resources home. Long before salaries became numbers in bank accounts, a wage already performed the same essential miracle. It allowed a person to exchange today's labor for tomorrow's survival. And long before workers demanded more money, they had learned to stop working when the grain did not arrive. That was the economics